True.
Good evening, everyone. Just waiting for a few more people to join. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Glad we finally get to do this tasting. So we'll give it a couple more minutes, a few more people joining. Good to see. Decent amount in. If you don't mind, it's always nice for the hosts to actually see faces and reactions. So if you want to turn on your cameras, that's a big help for us, so we can actually get a gauge of if we're talking nonsense or if we're enjoying what we're drinking tonight.
Evening, Oliver. Evening, all.
Evening, all. I'm just going to also put everyone on mute, and that way we'll, at the end of the session, if anyone wants to ask any questions, sort of, over the speaker. It's just, there's a lot of sometimes background chewing, babies crying, dogs barking, that sort of stuff. So it makes it a bit easier. All right, I think we might kick off now. My name's Oliver Maruda. For those who haven't met yet, I'm one of the co-founders of the Whisky List. So thank you all for joining tonight for this awesome tasting, which we've been super excited about. There's been a few delays, so apologies on behalf of us, Australia Post. As I'm sure everyone's well aware, crazy times with the amount of volume that's going through the door. If your kits haven't arrived, hopefully I've emailed you all. We're actually splitting this tasting into two, so we're repeating it again next Thursday. So if you join tonight and your kit hasn't arrived, drop me a message or drop me an email, oliver@thewhiskylist.com.au, and we'll send you the Zoom link if you haven't received it for next Thursday night's tasting. There's about 30 kits who are just, Australia Post has said, we've got them. We can't give them back to you. We're not going to process them until Monday next week. So we'll get them delivered for next week, but they're just sitting there doing nothing, which is very annoying. Apologies on that behalf. So if you haven't got your kits, let me know and we'll get you onto the tasting next week. Otherwise, we're recording all our tastings. So if you need to drop off or anything, it'll be on YouTube afterwards. We will have a small discount for the Musket Cask tonight, so I'll put that into the chat for anyone who's interested in buying it after you've tried it and you're enjoying it. We've got a little discount for everyone. And the bottle competition that we're running today as well, because we're splitting it into two tastings, we'll draw the winner after next week's tasting. And if you're one of the lucky winners, we'll obviously contact you. That way it's a little bit fair for those who can't make it today. We'll run it like that. But that's it for housekeeping. Please don't drink and drive. We're drinking some, higher ABV whiskies. Drink plenty of water, all that sort of stuff. If you have got a water droplet or a spoon, you can add a couple of drops of water to, some of those more subtle flavors, but the guys will kind of walk you through what's the best way to enjoy it. Otherwise, if there's any questions, just put it into the chat and we'll get through it throughout the tasting. Otherwise, we'll unmute everyone at the end for a couple of minutes, have a face-to-face chat. That's it from me. Please welcome live from Adelaide, Chewy and Fred Siggins. Welcome, gents. Let me just unmute you both. And we'll hand it over to you guys to tell us about this amazing new Australian distillery. New because new, we've only just started to really hear about it and talk about it. I know you've been around for a little while, but whiskey's now finally out on the market. So welcome, gents. Fred.
Thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening. As Ollie said, my name is Fred Siggins. I'm actually the Melbourne-based, one of the Melbourne-based ambassadors, whiskey experts for 78 Degrees, coming to you live from lockdown, not free to move around like my colleague Chewy over there in South Australia. So he works from the distillery and I work just in the Melbourne sort of hospitality and whiskey market most of the time. But we're really excited to be able to introduce you all to 78 Degrees Australian whiskey this evening. Like Oliver said, our distillery has been around for a little while. We've been producing gin for a number of years, but our first whiskey has just been released onto the market as of April this year. And really just this month, we've launched our second expression, which is our musket finish, which you guys are going to be able to try for the first time this evening, as well as some other fun bits and pieces. So without further ado, just to make sure that everybody has something delicious in their glass, please feel free to pour yourself the first dram of the evening, which is our 78 Degrees Australian whiskey. I'm not going to tell you too much about how this is made just yet, because I'm going to hand over to Chewy in a minute, who's going to walk you through some of the finer details of the production process. But what I wanted to do was really introduce you first and foremost to the ethos behind 78 Degrees whiskey, and just give you a little bit of a sense of why we made this whiskey the way that we do. So first and foremost, I want you to take any notions that you have about single malt whiskey or rye whiskey or Australian whiskey or, you know, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, whatever it is, and put that out of your minds, because this is a style of whiskey that you will never have seen before, because it's never been done before. In Australia, when we think of Australian whiskey, generally speaking, what we're talking about is a local imitation of a Scottish style, and in some cases of American styles. So, you know, most of the whiskey that's being produced in Australia right now is single malt in style, obviously 100% malted barley, double pot distilled. And then we've got some examples of rye whiskies, corn-based whiskies, that type of stuff. But if we have a think about the Australian beer industry, or if we have a think about the Australian wine industry, they both went through a period of doing a really good job finding their feet by trying to recreate styles that come from other places. But when they really, really hit their straps was when they were able to come up with unique styles that Australia has become known for internationally. So I always think of Australian pale ale, not the same as an English pale or a German one or an American one. It's got that beautiful kind of bright tropical hop note to it. And we've got a sort of defined style of Australian pale ale now. You know, Australian Shiraz is known the world over, and it's not the same as the Shiraz and Syrah that come from Europe and other parts of the world. We've created a unique version of it. So with 78 Degrees whiskey, we really set out to try to help define what Australian whiskey means beyond styles that are traditional from other places. So that's the first thing that I want you to think about with all of these whiskeys, is that we are very deliberately going outside of traditional production methods to create something that's uniquely Australian and that's uniquely appropriate for the Australian climate and for Australian drinkers. The second thing that I really want to kind of have as an overarching theme in terms of the way that we produce whiskey and all of our spirits at 78 Degrees is sustainability, because it's really fundamental to our whole brand and fundamental to the way that we do things. We built a new facility a few years ago at a place called Lot 100, which is where our distillery is located. It's also where our brewery is located, because we also make mismatch beer on that same site. And that has really had a pretty big influence in the way that we approach making whiskey as well, which we'll hear about in a minute. We also have our sort of cellar door and hospitality venue there. There's a restaurant at Lot 100, which is really beautiful, making use of a lot of Australian native ingredients. And that site was really sort of built for purpose to be as sustainable as possible in terms of production. It's got 3 bores on site, 3 wells on site, which bring in water from an underground water table. So we're completely off the grid as far as water is concerned. And those bores are naturally replenished with rainwater. We also have 300 megawatts worth of solar panel on the roof of the distillery and brewery. So most of the time we're off the grid for power, and on sunny days actually feeding power back into the grid. And in terms of the way that our whiskies are made, we've actually got a completely closed loop system. So the grains all come from one specific barley field, or the majority of the grains come from one specific barley field that's relatively close to the distillery. The only time we add water to it is at the mashing point, because it then gets fermented and distilled on grain using that same batch of water. And then after it's done, any wastewater that we have collected, just from washing things and that, goes back and forth around the distillery, gets collected. We have a purpose-built water treatment facility on site, which cleans up the water and makes it good enough again to then use for irrigation. So it ends up filtering back down into those same aquifers that we got it from in the first place, or being used to irrigate the fields around the distillery. And then the pot ale that's left over from the distillate of the whiskey is actually really high naturally in sulfur and potassium and all sorts of good stuff. So we can actually spray it back onto the same grain field as a natural fertilizer and a natural pesticide, and therefore reducing that farmer's reliance on chemical pesticides and fertilizers. So those are just a couple of the things that I want you guys to hold in your mind as we go through this whiskey range and taste these products, to think to yourselves, it's not a single malt, it's not a rye whiskey, it's not a bourbon, it's not any of that other type of stuff. It's really a uniquely Australian whiskey that's produced with the Australian climate and hopefully the Australian palate in mind. Seeing some pretty cool tasting notes.
Yeah, I was noticing those coming through as well. Play-Doh in a good way, porridge.
Yeah, porridge, honey. A lot of people talk about that cereal note. And again, I'll let Chewy get into a little bit more detail about how this is made. But the predominant grain that's used in this product is unmalted South Australian barley. So a huge proportion of the grain in here is unmalted. So we're going to get that really nice, bright, fresh grain character. Lots of chocolate, grass, porridge, honey, all that type of stuff. A little bit of tobacco and sawdust, definitely Play-Doh, but in a good way. Yeah, because it's still got that kind of young, bright, sort of vibrant thing going on. Starting to get some questions about the more details of production as well. So Chewy, do you want to tell everyone?
I'm in.
Bad boy.
Tag me in. I'm going. Hey everybody. First and foremost, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's great to obviously have all you guys in front of us, and seeing the numbers. It's really quite heartwarming to see everybody tuning in to hear us chat about whiskey. So that's awesome. A big thing for us, obviously, as Fred kind of mentioned before, 78 Degrees has always been a brand. Initially, we founded Adelaide Hills Distillery. So that was founded back in 2014 by a guy called Sasha LaForgia. And within Adelaide Hills Distillery, 78 Degrees was the gin brand. As we've transitioned, as we've grown, what we found was that, anybody can relate to 78 Degrees. It's something that is universal because it's a number. Anybody can remember it. It might be their favorite number. It might just be something that sticks in their head. But Adelaide Hills Distillery, unless you've been to the region and seen it, it's probably not quite as memorable. So what we found was that a lot of people coming to the distillery that we were kind of interacting with, we'd say, hey, have you ever tried Adelaide Hills Distillery before? Blank faces. 78. 78. It was almost that in instant recognition. So what we've kind of decided was, we're going to start moving everything towards the 78 Degrees brand. And with that, we've added in a vodka and a whiskey. So we're now 78 Degrees is now a spirit brand.
Chewy, quick question.
Yeah.
Where does the 78 Degrees, what's that in reference to?
Thank you. So it goes back to our gin initially. Obviously originating from the gin brand, but essentially, for those of you that know, obviously 78 Degrees is the evaporation point of not just alcohol, ethanol particularly. However, the reason why that's relevant with our gin is we use what's known as a hybrid still. So it's not your standard traditional Scottish pot still. It's got a pot component, and it's got a column rectifier. Then we've got a vapor basket, and then we've got a condensing column. So it's basically all in the same kind of vein, the same kind of structure. It's still 100% batch production. It's not column distillation in terms of being continuous distillation. So everything goes through one run. We then have to clean it all out, and then we refill it and do the secondary run. All of our distillation is all 100% monitored via temperature. So essentially what we see is all of the different points of the still and what temperatures they're sitting at. Around the base of that pot component, that's where our heat jackets are. So steam powered, that's where it gets hot. So the temperatures in there are about 110 degrees Celsius. As it gets to the top, where our reflux bulb is, at the very top of the pot component, reaches about 100 degrees Celsius. It then comes into the bottom of the column component. It's at 95 degrees Celsius. Gets to the top of the column component, 85 degrees Celsius. But where that vapor basket sits, being so far away from that heat element, the temperature's actually dropped to 78 degrees Celsius. So one, what that means is 100% ethanol. There's no methanol or rubbing alcohols in there. It's what we want. But second as well, what that means is that lower temperature actually extracts a lot more of those brighter compounds from the botanicals that we use. So initially 78 degrees was very much tied into our gin. Obviously, though, as well, it's got a connection to the whiskey because it's the evaporation point of ethanol. It's relevant across all spirits, really. So yeah, with our whiskey, what we really sought to do was rather than replicate, we wanted to innovate. We've been focused very much on one, sustainability, two, being local. Trying to showcase local ingredients, native ingredients, work with local communities, and then three, we've always tried to be as good as we possibly can be. And we've always got this kind of saying that, 100% quality, the badge is the logo. The logo is the badge. It's got to pass certain gates before we release it. But then also as well, we have this kind of closed loop system where we reevaluate everything that we've released. And we've got this saying that the next product will be better than the last. So when we looked to create a whiskey, we didn't want to just go and create single malt whiskey. We didn't want to go and create Irish whiskey. We wanted to create something that was uniquely Australian. So what we did was we sat down and looked at what we wanted to achieve. So the first thing, obviously, being quite important to us was being sustainable. Second, we wanted it to be at a good price point. Now, we've got this kind of saying that, we'd rather be your everyday whiskey than be that special occasion whiskey. I'm sure, as we all know, Australia for a long time has been very much, driven by quite very small production, which then generates into high price point and low volume bottlings. So we didn't want to be that. We wanted to release a 700 ml bottle, and we wanted it to be around about the $100 mark so that it was accessible. We'd much rather be that product that when you run out of that bottle, you go straight out and buy another one. You've always got it, and you still buy those special bottlings that you have and enjoy, and you look to experience from time to time. And then third, probably very much driven by the fact that we wanted to be down that end of the price spectrum. We wanted to create a very big and bold style of whiskey. Knowing what the competition's like down that end of the spectrum, we didn't want to compete. We wanted to add to the category. We wanted to create more range and more range in the spectrum, I guess, and create something that was different to what else was being produced. So then we kind of looked about how we were going to achieve that. We're very lucky. The brother-in-law of one of the directors of the company actually owns a barley field. I know, what are the chances, right? Kind of made to produce whiskey. So we've actually got access to our raw material, which is obviously fantastic. Now, South Australia is actually quite highly regarded as being one of the best regions for growing barley in the world. 85% of what is grown in South Australia is used for brewing purposes and goes straight to export. So the guys we get our barley off originally were producing a lot of stuff for Sapporo in Japan, but a lot of it goes to the UK and the US and Europe. The reason why it's highly regarded is because they've only recently allowed it to be GM, genetically modified. So it was all GM free, and it's all 100% rainwater fed as well. Getting that as a raw material, we then had a decision what we wanted to do with it. If we wanted to create a single malt whiskey, essentially we needed to malt it, or we could leave it as it was. So we did a bit of research. Malting, I'm sure as everybody here knows, is the process of essentially tricking that barley seed into thinking that it's springtime, because what will start to happen is it will start to germinate. A little plant will pop out, but that plant needs fuel. So what happens inside that seed is that enzymes are released that will break down starch, which is essentially sugar, but long chain sugar, into more simple sugars, i.e. maltose, which is a disaccharide. It's a 2-chain sugar. And that simple sugar is what can then feed the plant to grow. That is also what we need to create booze with. So that's why the malting process is generally done. The process is then stopped by heating the barley seed. That's obviously where you normally go kiln it or peat it in Scotland. That kills it off, and now you've got your sugars kind of contained before that plant started to eat it. Problem was, though, to keep it wet and keep it warm in order to think of it it's spring, and then to heat it afterwards uses a lot of energy. So it's 150 cubic meters per ton of water and 1,800 kilowatts per hour per ton of energy. And that's actually going off Port Ellen maltings, which, being a commercial producer, you'd hope would be doing it pretty well. So we kind of put our hands up and went, you know what, that's not sustainable. So we took the decision to leave it unmalted. Instead, what we wanted to do was to amplify that flavor. We wanted to add in malts in order to kind of lift that character. So we use around about 80% of our Malalar barley, and then the other 20% is made up of what we call specialty malts. They're all different roasts. They're all different styles of barley, but they're essentially all there to kind of enhance that flavor profile and give us that big character that we want. It's not like Archie Rose. We don't produce them all completely individually. What we do is we mix them all in together. It all gets milled through a roller mill together, and then we mash it all in together. Now, the mashing actually begins with the final run or the product from the last distillation. So we repurpose our condenser water. Obviously, what we do when we condense our alcohol spirit back down is use cool water. Naturally, what happens there is that water will then rise in temperature. So that's what we then use to mash in on the next run so that we don't have to waste energy getting it up to temperature. We then bring that up to around about 78 or 80 degrees Celsius. Do you like what I did there? I was trying to tie in the 78. and essentially that's kind of where we're done. So anyway, from there, I suppose this is kind of where it starts getting a little bit more interesting. So normally when you're mashing in, what you're doing is creating a wort. And essentially what that is essentially dissolving all of your sugars into liquid form so that yeast can start eating it. And normally what you'll do is you'll do that in what is known as a Lauter tun. Lauter is a German word, comes from brewing. And essentially what that means is it's literally the word that means strain. So normally what happens is as its gravity drains, it will pass through this mesh floor and take out all of your barley husks. You can then take your liquid and ferment it. And that husk normally is then taken as a waste product. The problem is before you take it as a waste product, that husk has got a lot of sugar in there. And because obviously, particularly in Scotland, you want to make as much as you can from what you've got available. So what you normally do is you'll then sparge. So sparging is rinsing with warm water, 60 to 80 degrees Celsius. And it's normally done 2 to 3 times, depending on the distillery, sometimes up to 4. Again, though, in order to create that energy to heat that water, we took the decision not to do that. So our mash tun actually doesn't have that floor. It's got nothing on the bottom. So husk and all are all transferred over to our fermentation tank. We add in our yeast, 7-day ferment. But what we see there, we initially did that for a sustainability point. But what we've seen is something completely different. For those of you that drink wine, red wine, I'm sure you've heard the term fermented on skins before. For those of you that drink beer, I'm actually drinking a hop burst IPA at the minute. You've probably heard of dry hopping. Essentially what that is it's something where something else is inside that fermentation tank along with your sugar. Obviously what your yeast is doing is eating sugar, releasing ethanol, carbon dioxide. But if there's something else in there with carbohydrates, it will also start to eat those. And normally what it will do is it will release flavonoids or flavor compounds and hazing, which is why your hazy IPA is hazy, because it's releasing oils in form of flavor that add to that flavor. Wine, it adds tannin. In beer, it adds fruity components. For us, it gives us this really, really biscuity character. So a lot of those kind of flavor notes that you guys were picking up on, porridge, yeah, absolutely. Because everything's done on husk, we're getting those really biscuity, barley-driven flavors coming out of our ferment. Everything's then transferred to the still, and we then distill on husk as well. Normally, that's a bit of a no-no. If something's hot and you've got particle, what will normally happen is it will stick and burn. I'm sure if anyone's ever left the rice on the stove for too long and not stirred it, probably come back to it and it's all stuck on the bottom. Don't know if you've ever tried to eat it. I definitely have, probably more in my student years. Didn't want to waste it. Doesn't taste good. I don't recommend it. So essentially what happens is if it starts to stick and burn inside the still, the distillate coming out on the far end will basically taste like that burnt rice with a bit more of that porridge note to it, obviously. We're quite lucky. Glenfarclas, they do a pressurized extraction of that wort. So they use a lauter, but they pressurize it. And what that does is it gives them a lot of residual particles. To combat that, they've got inside the still what's called a rummager, which is essentially like a big mechanical washing machine arm that moves around the inside of the still as it distills with chainmail that drags along the bottom so that any particle that starts to stick is essentially scraped off. What that does, though, is that obviously then degrades the copper. So you're essentially having to replace your copper a lot more frequently, which, again, obviously is not particularly sustainable. Because we originally designed our still for gin production, we had something installed which is called an agitator. so that if we ever distilled botanicals within the pot still, we vapor infuse them all. But if we did, there's actually a big long arm with a paddle on the bottom that just spins the liquid so that you wouldn't ever get that burning and that sticking and that caramelization. That actually allows us to distill on husk as well with particle in there. We only distill one time. So we essentially go from ferment or wash around about 14% alcohol. Through one distillation run, it then comes out at 75% alcohol. So we've taken it all the way up to what we want it to be. Not only that as well, because we're using a hybrid still, one of the reasons why stills are made out of copper, a little bit like a cake mixer, big industrial one. But yeah, it definitely kind of spins in that same way. But yeah, essentially, because of the way our still's designed, whenever you ferment anything, as yeast dies, it's called yeast autolysis. So it will start to break apart and it releases sulfites. That's what it tends to be made up of. So that's why ferments can be quite sulfury. And one of the reasons why stills are made out of copper is because, I don't know if you remember chemistry back at school, but when copper and sulfur come into contact, they form a new compound called copper sulfate. So through reflux, what happens is as the alcohol evaporates and hits the still, it will turn back to liquid. But every time that happens, it's removing those sulfites from the distillation, from the spirit. By having this big reflux pot and then those 5 plates in the column still, we've seen enough reflux there that essentially we've removed all of that copper sulfate. There's a big blue powder inside the still, but what's remaining at the end of that distillation, our pot ale, rich in copper sulfate, it's a classified organic pesticide, so you can actually spray that onto crops and still have a classified organic classification, an organic classification. It's rich in nutrients, as Fred mentioned, from the husks, nitrogen, stuff that you need. So we actually take that back to Malalar, get sprayed back onto the barley. So even our final waste product is then repurposed into something else. Our spirit, we proof down. We fill all of our casks at 58% alcohol. Obviously, there's an industry norm around 63.5. And for those of you that know, that was something that was developed by the University of Edinburgh alongside Dr. Bill Lumsden. And essentially what they found was that the optimal percentage of alcohol to mature within wood was at 63.5% alcohol in Scotland. And that's why we don't, because we're not in the same climate as Scotland. And what we found was at 63.5, it just, my brother's a big agitator. Good call. And what we found was, it didn't suit the climate. Up in the hills, it can be quite cool, but it can be really hot as well. We're in this big warehouse. We've got lots of production going on, and it really just didn't suit our whiskey. So we fill at 58. We are aging in ex-South Australian red wine casks. We don't really drum on about it being red wine, mainly for the fact that we have them all coopered essentially. So they're all shaved, toasted and charred. And what that means is essentially, obviously when you've got a cask, it's made up of staves. A red wine cask, all of those staves will be red. So the whole of the inside will be red. By shaving it, what you're doing is essentially bringing it back to the new oak so that the only red wine that is residual is still within those pores. So it's not going to have a massive impact on the whiskey. We then toast it to caramelize the sugars, and then we char it to build up this layer of carbon, because obviously what happens through maturation is the liquid will go into the pores and back out. And if you've got that layer of carbon, just like they're using for bourbon, essentially it's passing through a carbon filter each time. It's helping to further, filter your product. So that's why we have them recharred as well. The reason why we use red wine casks primarily is purely for, essentially when you cut down a tree, you've got the bit like this, okay? It's a big wide bit. The bit in the middle is where it's young. Trees grow from the inside out. So it gets quite sappy, a bit bitter in terms of casks. A bit on the outside's the older bit, so it gets quite porous, not particularly good for making casks. So you lose a lot of liquid, but it also gets a bit tired. The bit in the middle is generally the prime cut. There was a release done in Scotland by Glenmorangie where they looked at different cuts of the tree. But normally the wine industry get the prime cuts, so to speak. Sounds a bit like a steak, doesn't it? But they get the prime cuts. And the reason why is because when you think of wine, it goes in at 14% alcohol. It's only in there for a year or two. So the wood's got to be super active. It's got to be able to give a lot of flavor to that wine in that time. On the flip side of that, though, we've had some, we get some ex-bourbon casks, and essentially alcohol as 100% alcohol, it doesn't exist, but close enough to, is a solvent. So it will literally, anything that it comes into contact with, it will just strip it out. It will strip all flavor. If you think of Kentucky, generally what happens there is they fill mid-60s-ish, but they actually see reverse angel share. So they actually lose more water than alcohol. So the ABV actually goes up. So that's why all the antique collection stuff's in the 70s, because the ABV generally goes up in that climate. So they'll pull it out around the 70 mark, which means that there's not really a lot left in that wood. You know, it's also been in there for a minimum 4 years. So by using ex-wine casks, it means that there's actually a lot more left in the wood as well. So what you've got in front of you, this is batch number 4. And this is a marrying of essentially about 12 different casks. We'll probably move straight on to Muscat. Also as well, guys, like feel free to just drop in and taste some of the others as well. I'll keep on chatting, but yeah, we'll kind of go through them. And, you know, if you want to go through them in your own time, by all means do that as well. So the Muscat's very, very recent. Fred, when did we release the Musket cask?
Really just first sort of started sending it out to shops and to the mailing list and stuff last month. And just in terms of the maturation, I just want to make the point because it's something that people ask a lot. The casks that we're using are full-size casks. So there's some American oak ex-red wine and some French oak ex-red wine. Like Chewy said, they've all been shaved and toasted and recharred as opposed to something like Starwood, which has gone into wet fill red wine casks. So you get a lot more of that red wine influence. But they are all full-size casks, 200 and 300 liters. Obviously a lot of newer Australian brands, especially when they're sort of first releasing whiskies, tend to rely a little bit on small format casks to get a bit more cask influence in a shorter period of time. But we decided that, you know, we wanted to have a good balance between grain character, spirit character, and cask character, and not just absolutely blitz all of that beautiful Malalar barley with really heavy cask influence. So yeah, 200 and 300 liters for the most part.
Just to jump in. So quick hands up in the room. Who likes the very first whiskey we've just tried? Great. That's high praise. Usually the first whiskey in tastings is like the palate cleanser to warm you up, but
Beautiful.
you know.
Like, it's good to hear as well. Sorry, I can't see everybody on my screen, but Ollie's feedback was great. It's awesome as well that it's been, you guys are enjoying it.
The other thing I just wanted to kind of recap, there's many ways to make whiskey. There's no like, you know, obviously you need to turn your barley, go through your process, distill it, but like that there's a kind of a science method to it. But then the type of barley you use, the way you turn it into your sugars, then your yeast, then the different stills, like that is all up for grabs in terms of like the Irish triple distill. You've just mentioned you've distilled it once, which was news to me. And I think that's really interesting because most Australian distilleries just follow the Scottish or the Bill Lark method, which is, you know, traditional big fat copper still, lots of energy usage, all about sustainability, no waste, using the husk. Who came up with this sort of I'm going to call it innovation because it sounds brand new. I don't know any other Australian distillery who's using your method.
Yeah, it was definitely pioneered by Sasha. Sasha's a very, very smart man and a very, very humble man. You know, he's very quiet, very timid, but yeah, he's very, very insanely smart. And yeah, he basically, and it was definitely trial and error as well. You know, I'd love to say that from day dot we were producing whiskey like this, but you know, we weren't. We had some other malts in there at one point. We've played around with different ferment times. We've played around with different mashing. We played around with different casks, you know, and it's trial and error. You know, you definitely, you find yourself, I think, in those formative years. And that's also part of the reason why we're putting it in batches as well. You know, I think as we evolve and as we grow, you know, the age of it will probably increase a bit. We will probably change some of the methods that we're doing, and that will change a little bit. And I think the beauty of having batch whiskey is that you can actually start celebrating those changes rather than being held accountable for consistency. You know, we can talk about how it tastes different in batch 1 to batch 20 because, you know, we were doing X, Y, and Z back in the early days. And I think that's a really cool thing to be able to do. You know, generally through maturation, what happens is that phenols will break down into flavonoids or flavor compounds. And being quite a phenolic style of whiskey, it will likely age really, really well. So I think that, you know, come 10 years, we might kind of go, you know what, 10's the magic number. That's it. Hang your hat on it. And, you know, we might do away with batches. Who knows? But, you know, I think that's the exciting thing about whiskey, isn't it? You don't know until you're there.
Well,
so,
You mentioned you're going to improve every single batch, every new product as part of your ethos as a company, which excites me. So what we're trying now is the fourth version, fourth iteration, and then the fifth one's guaranteed to be better. So if you enjoyed today, then go to your bottle shop and buy it online tonight, and the next one you get is going to be guaranteed to be better. So that I love that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Idea.
So next up we got the Musket Cask. So Musket Cask, let's say this is brand new, literally just out. So we were looking at something, obviously to kind of, I suppose, go alongside the Australian whiskey. And we really wanted to do something that, spoke again of being Australian. Muscat is a truly Australian style of fortified, also called liqueur muscat. It originates up in Rutherglen, Northern Victoria. And it's literally, it can't be made in the same way and called muscat anywhere else. So when we were looking at doing something with a fortified, it kind of made sense to obviously focus on something that was uniquely Australian. In terms of what we do with it, it's very straightforward. We use South Australian muscat barriques. So barriques are around about 225 litres or so in size. They're not huge. So it obviously is going to impart a fair amount of flavour. And we actually use a Grand Muscat. So there's classifications of muscat based on age. And Grand Muscat means that it's more than 20 years in cask. We then finish it in those muscat barriques for around about 3 months before then decanting it. What we find is that it's there, it's on the front. I get all these kind of raisins, stewed prunes, dates, what you'd expect from a muscat style of whiskey. But then I still get that unmistakable Australian whiskey as well. I get the grain coming through. I get that real chocolatey note. I get the tobacco smoke. And it's all kind of still there. So I really like it. I think it's a good addition to the range as well. So the way muscat's made is generally they'll pick the grapes very late. So they generally start to turn raisiny on the vine. They'll then ferment it, and partially the way through fermentation, around about halfway through, they'll then fortify it with grape spirit, and that will stop the yeast doing its job, and it will essentially halt the fermentation process. What that means is that there's a lot of residual sugar in there because the yeast hasn't done its job and eaten it all up. So it tends to be quite sweet. They then put it inside casks, and they generally leave it in quite hot locations. What they're looking to achieve essentially is baking of that muscat, so that a lot of the liquid water will start to evaporate out, and then those flavors and those sugars inside will start to intensify and almost cook inside the cask. For that reason, we tend to get quite a lot out of those barrels as well. Lots and lots of sweet demerara on the front as well. I get lots of brown sugar, but yeah. I don't actually have any with me to taste along with you. Drinking the Australian whiskey.
And here we go. I'll show you guys the bottle. This is the muscat finish. Yeah, so I don't know. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased, but I'm a big fan of some of the label designs that we're putting out these days. Just a couple of notes on some of the flavor notes that you guys are talking about with the Australian whiskey. Somebody said Cocoa Pop crackles, and Cocoa Pops is one of my favorite tasting notes with the Australian whiskey. But if you guys remember that Chewy mentioned that on top of that unmalted Malalar barley, which makes up about 80% of the grain bill, we're also using specialty brewers malts again, and we're sort of leaning on some of the knowledge of the brewers that we have right there on site with us in terms of the specialty malts that we use. And one of them is a chocolate malt. So we do really get that beautiful sort of chocolatey grain cereal note coming through as the combination of those two grains. There's a bunch of other stuff in there as well. Yeah, and then with this muscat finish, what I always find is that fortified wine character, all those beautiful kind of juicy, rich fruits that Chewy's been talking about, they kind of round out the edges of the whiskey a little bit. Like you said, you definitely get some of that dried fruit character on the nose, and then you get that beautiful sort of brown sugar demerara thing sort of coming up through the finish. And while all of those kind of beautiful, bright, fresh grain flavors is still there, it's just sort of shaved them off a little bit and kind of lengthened out the nose and the finish a little bit, which is really exactly what you want a fortified wine cask to do without overpowering the spirit character.
So Fred, we got a question from Hugh, which I think's really great question. Total time in barrel for the Australian whiskey, the first time we tried, and the muscat. And is it fully maturated in the muscat or just finished?
No.
Two questions there.
So with the Australian whiskey, it's the currently, it is a vatted expression. So like Chewy said, the batch that you guys have got is about 12 different casks that went into the batch. And I think between 2.5 and 3.5 years. Is that right, Chew?
Yeah, around about. We use our oldest stocks, which are around about 4 now, and then down to 2 years, obviously being the minimum for Australian whiskey. So yeah, average is out at around about the 3.5 year mark, we reckon.
And then with the Musket Cask, it's exactly the same as the Australian whiskey, except once it's been decanted out of that, it's then finished in the Musket Casks for about 3 months. But unlike the red wine casks that we're using for the Australian whiskey, the Musket Casks are wet filled. So they haven't been recoopered, they haven't been shaved and charred. So the wood itself is still soaked in that musket wine. So we're seeing quite a lot of character of that musket come through, even just from a relatively short finishing period.
Oh, we make great musket locally here, so take advantage of that. Totally.
Absolutely. I mean, and especially when you're talking about a 20-year-old musket, that wood has really, really been absolutely drenched in the stuff, and it's soaked right into the pores of the wood. We're definitely not talking about some of the stuff that we're seeing more and more commonly coming out of Scotland, where the casks are really just being conditioned with sherry or with port, specifically for the purposes of making whiskey. One of the real advantages that we have in Australia in terms of our whiskey industry is access to these beautiful old fortified, like genuine fortified casks, and they're becoming less and less common everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I just saw one there for what type of cask do we use? Was that for the Australian whiskey? So we don't normally say it's essentially it's all ex red wine casks, and if I'm completely honest with you, it's all Shiraz casks pretty much. I'd even go as far as to say it's all pretty much Yalumba these days as well that we're using, but obviously we don't kind of harp on about it because the focus really after shaving it back isn't on the X wine. It's more about the wood that we're using. But yeah, it's Yalumba Shiraz casks these days that we're filling into. Has everyone tried that? Has everyone already into the native grain? Should we move on to that one?
No, we haven't. I'm just going to call out. There's a lot of people agreeing it tastes grade 6 lunchbox. Love that note, Ben. But the Uncle Toby's apricot muesli bars or the yogurt tops, I completely agree.
Absolutely,
I love that as well.
And apricot muesli bars all over it.
With bread as well. My biggest tasting notes are for the distillery character, cocoa pops and apricots or dried apricots. So that's it's completely 100% fits in with that as well.
And then the muesli bar obviously is perfect because we're getting that really bright, fresh grain character from the unmalted barley, which I absolutely love in terms of a uniquely Australian whiskey because there's something about it that just kind of reminds me of like walking into a shed in the country, like that's full of hay and stuff like that, and then those kind of nostalgic Australian things like Milo and muesli bars and cocoa pops and all that stuff.
And we got another comment, black tea with some of that bitterness when I think you've overbrewed your tea, maybe.
Yeah, and because we are using some French oak, definitely, that's where some of that kind of black tea tannin is going to come through. Obviously, one of the kind of primary reasons to use French oak in general is because you get that nice sort of like bitter tannin, which help to balance out some of the sweetness that you're getting both from the fortified wine and from all the kind of natural sweetness that's coming through in the grain.
Awesome. Whilst everyone pours maybe whiskey number 3, the native grain, you highlighted the label before. I just want to highlight to people, not only is it a beautiful label, well done, but the transparency. So you've got grain location, traceability there. You've got obviously your ABVs, 700 mils. And then on the back here, hopefully it's coming through. You can see exactly the mash bill of what grains are used, the cask size, the cask makeup, the batch number, everything like that. So, and a QR code, which I'm assuming takes you to a website with full information about the whiskey. It's great to see more Australian distilleries, more distilleries around the world should be doing this level of transparency because we as consumers should know what we're drinking. And if there's flavors that we enjoy, we can also identify that, and then we can find similar whiskies or more whiskies in your core range that mimic that, and that helps us enhance our palates and improve our whiskey tasting journey. It's not just for basic transparency. I think everyone benefits from knowing what's in our glass.
Yeah, that's it. And you guys can actually type those coordinates into Google Earth and you'll get a satellite picture of the grain field where we get that Malalar barley from. It's super cool. Just real quick, one of the questions that we get quite often has just popped up in the chat, which is why we spell whiskey with an E. So I'll just address that briefly. There's a couple of different reasons. First and foremost, we really wanted this to be thought of as a New World whiskey, right? So when we look at the traditionally what we're talking about is it's generally Scotland that spells whiskey without the E, and then Australia tends to follow that convention. But again, what we're doing is mostly producing whiskies in that single malt Scottish style, whereas in the United States, they do spell it with an E. And again, so we wanted this to be thought of definitely as a New World style. The other thing is that if you look at the use of unmalted barley, historically, that's really been associated with Irish whiskey, much more so than Scottish. And the Irish spell whiskey with an E. So another good reason there. We also did take a little bit of inspiration in terms of our production methods, using the hybrid still and using the specialty brewers malts and stuff like that from some of the really cool stuff we're seeing coming out of the American craft single malt movement. But first and foremost, we just didn't really want people to think of this as another Australian single malt whiskey. We wanted them to know straight away that it was something different.
Yeah. And I think the thing is as well, obviously, that the Australian whiskey scene has obviously been very much pioneered by Bill Lark, the grandfather of whiskey, and he's done amazing things for it. But obviously the whole Bill Lark story starts with Glenfiddich, drinking a bottle of Glenfiddich with his father-in-law, and talking about why whiskey wasn't being done in Australia. They talk about in Scotland, pristine waters, grain. We've got that in Tasmania. Why is nobody doing it? I went to his local member of parliament, petitioned for an old law of prohibition to be overturned. And the first thing he did once it was overturned is go to Scotland on a pilgrimage and take a load of photos. He took a photo of the Royal Lochnagar still, came back, got a little boilermaker to make it for him, a little German guy called Helmut, to make a still essentially for him out of copper. And upon that, obviously then became the first ever person to really do whiskey in Australia. From there, a lot of people would seek his advice. And, he did so many good things for the industry by going to people and talking through how whiskey was made. But because obviously what he wanted to achieve was a Scottish style, it then led to a lot of other whiskies kind of following suit. I don't know if a lot of people know, but Bill Lark in the formative years wasn't actually distilling at Lark. He moved over to Sullivan's Cove and was production manager over there. So obviously had a big impact over there as well. And as the Australian whiskey scene has grown, it's obviously grown on that blueprint. These days there are a lot of other people doing other things, but Whippersnapper, Tiger Snake, obviously producing American style corn-based whiskies. There's Mackey's doing a triple distilled Irish style of whiskey. And, we really didn't want to follow suit. We didn't want to replicate another style. We wanted to do something unique. And if I'm honest, part of the reason we put an E in there is because we wanted people to ask the question. We wanted people to say, why is there an E in the whiskey? Because we wanted to be able to have a conversation around the fact that we were actively trying to do things differently, and spark a conversation around it. Should we go into the native grain? Has anybody got any questions on the Muscat while we're still on it?
I've just got one. I think they accidentally just sent it to me. Hold on. What grand Musket casks did you use?
Grand Muscat. They were all from South Australia. So Petriti wines.
Yeah.
Cool. Hope that answers your question, mate. Let's jump into the native grain.
All right. Native grain. So native grain was actually the very first whiskey we ever released. So originally released back in 2019, the initial batch. The native grain, again, was really, I suppose, that way of trying to focus on what being an Australian style of whiskey meant to us. Being a brand that's focused on native or Australian for a long time, in terms of making gin, it can be fairly simple to the point that you've got all this amazing flora around us in Australia. By taking that and distilling it and creating a gin is a really good way of having that local Australian flavor. But it's not something that had really been done before with whiskey. So we really kind of sat down and thought about how we could achieve it. And something we came up with was the focusing on native grains. There's an abundance of native grains here in Australia that, are everywhere, that have been used for generations, but unfortunately aren't commercially grown. So it was focusing on that and taking it and incorporating it into our mash bill. Initially, the focus was on Waddle Seed. So Waddle Seed comes from the acacia. You guys probably see them around. Wattle flowers, they're all yellow at the minute. And the reason why you see them around is because they're actually our most abundant native food source. So there's around about 386 species of acacia. They grow everywhere. Twice a year, they go to flower, and then they produce seeding pods. They drop the seeds. Nobody collects them. So generally, we pay around about $95 a kilo when we want to buy Waddle Seed. It's pretty expensive. And it was something that was really used a lot by Indigenous people. It was really useful because when that seed drops, what they would do is put blankets out, collect it as it dropped, but it literally turns out as we use it. So it's almost dried. So what they could do is they could store it. So when other food sources started disappearing, it was always there. It was a staple. It was also quite versatile. One, because when you ground it into a flour, like most grains, you can make bread from it. So they'd make like a damper bread. But also it's a lot like coffee. So it has a lot of, it's rich in oils. So when you roast it, those oils will start to caramelize. You'll start to get coffee, hazelnut, chocolate notes coming through, which when you put that with whiskey, you know, it's a good time in a glass. The problem is that obviously being very much pioneered by a Scottish blueprint, it means that a lot of the infrastructure coming around, the legislation around whiskey has very much been that way inclined. Scotland's very strict laws that state that whiskey has to be made 100% from cereal grains. To put that into perspective, America's not. America, it has to be made 100% from grains. So they don't have to be cereal grains. And that's why there's people like Koval playing around with quinoa, which quinoa isn't a cereal grain. Here, our law is the same as Scotland. So it has to be made 100% from cereal grains. And as much as Waddle Seed is a grain, it's not cereal grain. So when we released the very first batch of native grain, we had people knocking on our door saying, you can't call it a whiskey. And knowing that we wanted to produce a whiskey down the line, rather than try and fight it, we just kind of went, okay, sorry. And we kind of halted it there. We shifted and we looked at what we could focus on instead. And we landed on weeping grass. So weeping grass being a grass species, much like rye is a grass species, it's a lot like an endemic rye. So you get a lot of those similar characteristics. It's got spice to it. I get lots and lots of black pepper, earthy notes. You get this real kind of eucalypty character, almost like a menthol that I tend to get with rye as well. But it was something that we could get an abundance of. The problem is, because it's still not commercially grown, it's gone from $90 a kilo up to $195 a kilo. And we're about to do a new batch, and we're actually struggling to find it at the last price we got it at. So unfortunately, as much as we really believe in this product, it's obviously quite an expensive one for us to produce, as about 20% of what we mash in is actually of that native grain. We also still use the Malalar barley. So it's about 60% Malalar barley. And then we still use some of those specialty malts as well. So 20%, but we're using the lighter malts. We don't use those big chocolate and brown malts that we use in the Aussie whiskey. So it hasn't got that same chocolatey character. It's about trying to elevate the native grain up. It's aged exclusively in ex-Cabernet Franc casks. And again, unlike the Australian whiskey, we don't shave that back. We wet fill it. So you get more of that wine character coming through with the native grain. We are looking now at we've been looking for a while at trying to source other native species. And what we'd really love to happen is for the native grain to go back to being a series so that each release can focus on a different native grain as that focal point of the whiskey. At the minute, it's just proving really, really hard. So if anyone's got any leads to somebody that's commercially growing native grains, super interested to talk. But yeah, we are looking for people at the minute.
Can I just stop you and firstly congratulate you on a delicious tasting whiskey, but also congratulate you guys on World Whiskey Awards. You were the third Australian distillery to take out best whiskey. I think it's grain whiskey, right? Yeah. For this one here, Sullivan's won it a couple of times. Archie Rose won it last year, and then this year you guys took out one of the top awards for this particular whiskey. So congrats for a brand new distillery on the market. You guys are absolutely, I think, nailing it. Delicious.
Thank you. And yeah, it's always really nice to win awards, obviously. But it was great to see the competition in that category. Coming from a whiskey background, huge fan of Nika coffee grain and Nika coffee malt were both in that category. The Fuji Sanroku, who took it out a couple of years back, and also the Compass Box Hedonism as well. There was fantastic whiskies in that category, and to win it was awesome. If I'm honest, I think we were maybe mispositioned. Like, a grain whiskey to me is something that's generally continuously distilled from a base of corn or wheat or unmalted barley. Obviously, this ain't that. It's not produced in a continuous style. It's not produced from a base of unmalted barley or corn or wheat. It's quite different. We also won Australia's best blended malt with the Australian whiskey. Again, I'm sure you're aware that blended malts tend to be a blending of different single malt whiskies from different distilleries. Again, it's produced in the same distillery and the same still, but it's nice to win awards, so we'll take it. But I think there's probably a little bit of people probably aren't quite sure where to put some of the whiskey at the minute. So we got put into categories which, it was very good to win. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure that they completely represent the whiskey that we produce.
Oh, look, I think it's awesome, because to me, I think we'll look back probably, decades from now and see that this is literally the first ever whiskey ever produced in the world ever using an Australian endemic grain species. And for it to take out world's best grain whiskey, literally the first time it had ever been done, I think that's a pretty it's just a pretty amazing thing to have happen, to have those Australian endemic species be kind of recognized on a world stage like that in whiskey in a way that they just haven't been before.
Well, you got to remember the first distillers using barley did not expect, 700-800 years later, people would be going crazy for it. Or the same thing with, the Yanks with corn water. Sorry, I love my bourbons. I just had to drop that one in there too. But yeah, like, you guys at the frontier, you're innovating, you're experimenting. Someone needs to do it, and the fact that you guys are actually, getting your, jumping in and trying something different, and not just doing the same cookie cutter approach, which we fully respect and love. But there's so much room to grow, and as you said, you don't want to compete, you want to complement what's out there already, and your top work for doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. And I'd say as well, recognition's amazing, and to be able to, I suppose, propel the product into something that is talked about, and then have that conversation, I think it's an amazing thing as well. And yeah, I could talk about the native grain all day, because I think it's such a really cool project that we're really looking to grow on and expand as well.
And so here's the bottle, in case you guys haven't seen it before. It's just got the black version of the label on there. Pretty cool.
Hands up. So we got hands up for the first one. We did that already. Hands up if you like the second one, the Musket Cask. Cool. And keep your hands up if you enjoyed the native grain.
Good. Glad you guys are enjoying it. Hey.
Yeah.
Always nice to see. Yeah, a lot of people commenting on that kind of rice spice that you get coming through with the native grain, and that's absolutely something that we see. Like, as I said in the chat, I think that rye grain in general is something that's a little bit of a hardier grain. It grows in colder climates. It grows in, it doesn't need quite as much water and stuff like that compared to barley, and hasn't been engineered quite to the same extent as barley. So I think that that's a characteristic that we see in a lot of grains that are hardier and that haven't necessarily been over-engineered. You just get a little bit of more of that kind of like spicy, husky thing coming through, which is definitely true of this whiskey. And yeah, absolutely beautiful texture on it. And I think we're really seeing some of that kind of like fine French oak tannin come through from those Cab Franc casks, which is really lovely to see. And definitely some of those licorice notes that people mentioned as well. So yeah, it's actually, for being such a kind of new and different idea, to me, this is actually a super, super elegant and really quite refined whiskey, especially for obviously like having not sat in a barrel for years and years and years. So definitely a pretty special product, I reckon.
So just to kind of recap, the first whiskey was 44% ABV, as was the Musket Cask. This one is 46.2, so a little bump up. Was that just the right ABV to bottle it at, or?
Yeah, it was something that was done. And obviously as well, this was before the Australian whiskey too. So with this one, we tried it at different ABVs and we just landed on 46.2. If I'm honest, with the Australian whiskey, because we wanted it to be at a reasonable price point, we initially kind of set out to do a 40% whiskey. And it was only upon trying it and kind of going, you know what, I just don't think that that's the ABV. And we literally tried it at 40, 40.5, 41, 41.5, all the way through to 46, because obviously coming from a whiskey background, 46 is kind of the magic number. So I was kind of like, it's got to be at 46. And if I'm honest, it was just 44 was the magic number. It was very, it had a lot of cask influence as it got higher in ABV. It had a lot of distillery character as it got lower in ABV, and 44 was just a really good harmonious point between the two. So that's kind of what we landed on. It seemed to work.
I also just want to commend you guys in the distillery for launching, 700 ml whiskies. There's a huge debate about 500 in Australian whiskey. That's fine. We'll save that for another time. But great to have, a decent sized bottle, which is always I'm personally a fan for. But you're introducing a lot of Australian distilleries will just do, here's our bourbon cask, our red wine or port cask, and our sherry cask, and that's kind of it. And you just pick the three, and then sometimes a cask strength version or whatever. You've no, we're not doing that at all by the looks of it. You've got something as an introductory whiskey, the Australian whiskey around $100. You've now got the Muscat, you've got the native grain. We're about to try something new that's in the work in progress. I'm sure there's other experiments and stuff in the background that's, to come. So you're completely, I see more as like a journey of your distillery. You can start here and then level up as you go. That's my take on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. I like that. I like the analogy. That's awesome. It's 100%. We're certainly looking at, as we go, and there are a lot of things that we've played around with that we've got sitting in casks at the minute. Some exciting stuff coming up next year. And the one here, actually, the smoky one we're going to try. It's next. It's next, isn't it? The smoky one is something that was actually a collaboration. Should we move on to that one now? That's a good segue, isn't it?
It's a perfect segue.
Perfect segue. Perfect.
Sorry, Chewy, just real quick. Is the native grain about the same age as the Australian whiskey? I wasn't sure because I know we obviously had to switch gears from doing the Waddle Seed to the weeping grass.
Yeah, no, it's a little bit younger. So it probably sits, everything we did up until this year was a single cask bottling. And normally they'd be around about the 2.5 to 3 year mark. So they're pretty young. This year was actually the first year we've ever done a batch. So we actually married together 2 casks in order to get the 400. And that was purely because it just won that award. Because we'd release it once a year and at the price point it's at, it would normally not sell out. We'd normally have a couple of bottles left at the end of the year. And we had probably about 8 or 10 bottles left the day that the announcement went out. And within that 4-hour, 5-hour gap, it pretty much sold out of that old batch. So we kind of went, we don't have any available. Rather than not have something available, let's make sure that we do a bigger batch this time so that it's available for everyone to get hold of if they want to. So that's the reason why we did the larger batch.
And just to add, hopefully everyone's aware, but just in case, in Scotland, to call it whiskey has to be minimum 3 years in oak. In Australia, our legal limit is 2 years. So the moment it turns 2 years and 1 day, it's officially called whiskey in Australia. So that's why we can, you'll see this whiskey is 2.5 years. That's totally fine. It's a whiskey legally here. It's come of age.
Absolutely. So next up, we've got the Corsair. So show of hands, anyone heard of Corsair Distillery before? No? Just Fred. So Corsair are based in Tennessee. So they are a distillery based out of Tennessee who are producing whiskey, primarily single malt whiskey, although they do have a rye and some other whiskies as well. And they do a whiskey which they call their triple smoke. So what they do is they take beechwood, cherrywood, and peat, and they produce a peated style of whiskey. They were actually over here trying to find distribution. And the head distiller was in Adelaide and reached out and said, hey, I'm around. Is there any chance you guys are there for me to come over? And I guess the kind of light bulb went off with Sash and he's like, yeah, let's do something. How long are you in town for? So we kind of pitched this idea where we could do something collaboratively. So the concept behind this one was, I suppose, trying to take those 3 big whiskey producing nations. I mean, us, obviously, Australia, Scotland, and then also America as well, and kind of make something together. So what we did was we actually had some peated Scottish barley coming out of Thurso. up the north. I think it's the same place where Blackgate are getting their stuff from. And I think it's pretty much where Dan Morley from Highwayman's getting his stuff from now as well. So it's quite a big style of smoke. You know, it's up there as that big, intense style of smoke, or peat smoke, should I say. Now, we then took our Malalar barley, the unmalted barley, and we wet it. And the guys from Corsair, as the American influence, smoked it with cherry wood. And then we took it and we smoked it with red gums, which we got locally. So when we actually took over the property at Lot 100, we had to do some clearing, and there was a load of red gums there, and we cut them down and we repurposed it all. We've got lots of big, long tasting tables there now. The chefs use red gum. Red gum's actually one of the best woods in the world to use for cooking, because it heats pretty hot. It's a really good fuel source, but it also is very economical in the way that there's not really much left over when it's done. Talking to the chefs, they're like, it's great because in the pizza ovens, we don't have to clean it. We literally just sweep it, chuck a vacuum in there, it's done. Like, it's literally out of dust. So it's a really good fuel to use. So we use the red gum as the Australian component of the smoke. Again, we married it all together, milled, fermented, distilled all together. And now we've got a component sitting in red wine casks and a component sitting in bourbon casks. Because again, obviously we've got Australian and American. If only we'd done, I don't know, a Scottish cask as well of some sort, an Islay cask or something, that would have been an even better story. But essentially what we found is that when Fred was up there, we were actually tasting through it. And do you remember we were like, oh, ex-bourbon, that's delicious. That's really good. And then we're like, oh, ex-wine, that's delicious. And then we're like, oh, yeah. That's even better.
Yeah, that's our very scientific blending trials that we did while I was like,
how much of each did you use? About that much?
Yeah, exactly. That was after several gins as well, so I'm sure we were being very accurate about it.
Yeah, exactly. But this is going to be a limited release, and it's probably going to be out at some point. It will be out at some point next year. So keep an eye open for it. We will do with the stuff like this. We've only got, because they were only here for a short period of time, we've only got about 400 odd bottles of it. So there'll be a bit kicking around, but what we'll do is we'll release it to our whiskey club. So the people that are on our database will send out like a pre-sale, and then the rest we'll put on our website and do it all direct to consumer. So there won't be huge volumes, but there may be some more smoky stuff coming out down the line, to be confirmed at the minute.
I'm just going to say, wow, like I did not expect what's in my nose, and then on the palate, it's, yeah, wow. Well, hands up, who enjoys this one? Can you bottle it now? Like,
well, we have to start pulling samples to do big tastings. I think that's the big problem.
Yeah.
I think the barrels are getting kind of low because we keep on getting excited about it and wanting to pull barrel samples to do whiskey tastings with.
Yeah, we were talking about our angel share. And we were like, what's our angel share looking like? And we were kind of like, about 5%. Like, yeah, cool. And then I was chatting through volumes and stuff with Tim. So Tim Neal, he's our head of production essentially. So I have a lot of dealings with Tim and chatting through stuff. And I'm like, oh, well, what are we looking at? Like, you know, what are we looking at volumes of this? And he's like, our angel share's about 20%. I think it's because everyone's tasting it. And I'm like, what? Literally just disappearing.
Yeah. So you guys are our angels for this.
You are the angels
for this cask.
Can I just ask, how big is the distillery? How many people you got working? How many barrels are you putting down, a week, a month for? Like, in terms of scale, what are we kind of talking with, Adelaide Hills Distillery 78?
Yeah. So we've got, in terms of production team, there are two people basically make all of the booze. So superstars, AJ and Jess, they are our production supervisors, managers. Tim oversees. So he's head of operations, a production manager, and then Sasha basically oversees everything as the founder and head distiller. We have some people help out on the bottling line. So a couple of people help out with bottling as well. We are producing around about per year, we kind of estimated around about 50,000 litres the other day, which, in terms of Australia is pretty good. In terms of Scotland is obviously very, very small. Even I think Kilhoman in their first couple of years were about 150,000. So, it's very small production still, but we're looking at maybe upscaling. We're looking at adding in an extra day, Production team don't love the idea of it. We currently distill 4 days a week. So normally Friday's a clean day. So we'll clean down the still, we'll clean the distillery. So there's not really much work done on Friday. So we're talking about going a 5-day production schedule, which means that there'll probably be a 6-day work cycle. But who knows? You know, we might add an extra day as well, but we're probably then going to have to bump up the production team if we do that as well.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for explaining. I've got a question from Gerald right now. So he said, recap how it's made. You get peated Scotch barley.
Yep.
You then malt it. You then
it's already malted. So we bought the peated malt over. So that's pre-malted. And then we take the Malala unmalted barley, and we wet that, and then we smoke that. Corsair did it with cherry wood, and we did it with the red gum, and then we marry those 3 together.
So yeah, you can basically think about the grain bill for this one as being divided up into thirds. A third of it is the sort of traditional peated Scottish malt. Then you've got 2/3 of it that are unmalted Malala barley, same as the Australian whiskey. Like half of that 2/3 we took and smoked over red gum, and the other bit the Corsair guys smoked over cherry wood. So 2/3 unmalted barley that have been smoked kind of post harvest and all that, and then 1/3 of the peated Scottish malt.
I like Steph's comment. Sounds like a nuclear submarine project.
Yeah, just don't let the French get involved.
Yeah.
That's read your newspaper today in case you're not to current events. We're not talking submarines. We're talking whiskey here. Sorry to interject.
I saw somebody say as well, 50K just whiskey. Yes. So because of the way we make gin, which obviously I didn't want to touch on too much because we're tasting whiskey, we individually distill all of our botanicals. So what we do is when it's in season, we get what we think we're going to need for the year, and we distill it all in a pretty strenuous week block or so. So that means that we've got botanicals sitting in spirit form. So when we need to make a batch of gin, what we'll do is we'll draw from those resources and blend them together. That means that the still is free most of the year. So around about 80% of our production now is whiskey. Was there another question came through there as well?
Paul's asked the raw malt flavors. I'm definitely getting them. It's layered, and you can on your third or fourth sip, you can taste the layers come through.
Yeah, and that would just be because two components, 2/3 of it is unmalted barley.
That's it. And so yeah, you're going to get those kind of less cooked, because it is less cooked. You know, malting is really a way of kind of cooking the grains and converting the sugars and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we're definitely getting a fresher, more raw kind of greener character coming through. And in the same way that you'd see in that kind of pure pot still Irish whiskey style, where you get more of that kind of fresh grain flavor coming to the forefront, as opposed to just all of those like sort of sweeter, more kind of roasty, cooked, baked, malted barley characteristics. Which makes me think we should move on to dessert. Chewy, what do you reckon?
Is it dessert time? Let's do it.
I think it is.
Let's do it. So next up we have the apple brandy. So obviously deviating away from whiskey slightly, but still in the same realms, being an aged spirit, obviously. This one was done way back in the early days of around 2018. So back when we first moved up the hill, we produced this. So essentially what we did was, as you probably know, 78 Degrees is part of a family of brands. And within that family of brands for a long time, you've also had Mismatch Beer, which Fred mentioned before. We actually share our production space with those guys, and Hills Cider. So Hills Cider is where the story all starts. And the guy who I mentioned briefly, whose brother-in-law owns the barley field, a guy called Toby Klein, he was actually one of the founders of Hills initially, with a guy called Steve Dorman. So Hills Cider has probably been one of the big brands of the family for a long time. For those of you that know, we recently were acquired by Mighty Craft, so now we've stepped into a much larger family, and there's a lot more brands in there as well. Anyway, Toby, the guys producing Hills Cider, that's all done off-site. So we actually have that all juiced for us by the guys who own the Lot 100 site, the Shiraz family, at their juicery in Ashton Valley. So they juice it all and they send it to Raynella, where we've got the Hills Cidery. It's then fermented and turned into Hill cider. We had the idea to take some of that Hill cider and distill it and turn it into something different. Hill cider are a little bit unique in the way that, one, they only really use 100% eating apples. So they don't use cider apples. They use the ones that you've probably heard of before. They use Pink Ladies, Royal Galas, Granny Smiths. Generally for acidity, they'll add stuff like crab apples. But generally, they're very much those eating apples. Also quite beautifully, the guys at Ashton Valley, the reason why the Chiravello family, who were orchard growers, built a juicery is because what they were finding is all of the seconds fruit they were producing, the supermarkets wouldn't take. So they were forced to then sell it below cost price to people who would turn it into concentrate and then normally take it out of state. So it was leaving South Australia. Being an unsustainable model, they went, why are we doing this? Let's juice it ourselves. We can produce juice the way we want to, not from concentrate. Only form of preservation was pasteurization. No acids, no sweeteners in there, just juice. They built this state-of-the-art facility, which we've definitely taken components of and moved into Lot 100. Stuff like the wastewater plant was all from the Ashton Valley plant initially. So what they did was they formed, because they were using a lot of all of their seconds fruit once they built this juicery, they formed a cooperative in South Australia where they agreed to buy seconds fruit off pretty much all of the growers. They would pay above cost margin. So essentially they were all then selling it above cost price, all of the seconds fruit. Obviously meant that they were working off a sustainable model, and the guys at Chiravello or Ashton Valley had continuous supply of fruit. So 4% of every single Hill cider batch actually contains some of this seconds fruit. So it's a constant changing batch. Because they do all the juicing and they've got the relationship, it also means that every single batch of Hill cider, we've got full traceability. So we know where every single apple has come from, who picked it, when it was picked, and what's gone into that batch of Hill cider, which is something, considering these days the batch sizes are 38,000 litres. It's pretty impressive to know where every single piece of fruit came from. So what we did was we took a component of that. Luckily in Adelaide, there's actually, at the Adelaide University, we've got an old alembic still that came over from Charente way back when, I don't even know, I wouldn't hazard a guess. For those that don't know, an alembic still essentially is like a pot still with a big long neck, so that you really get those light alcohols coming through. You don't get those really oily congeners coming into the final spirit. So produces that nice kind of fruity style of spirit. We took the Hill cider ferment and put it into the alembic still and distilled it and then aged it in ex-Cabernet Franc casks, just like we use for the native grain. Unfortunately, if you've not tried it to date, we've just sold the very last batch of what was done on that alembic still, and every future batch is now produced out of our Lot 100 distillery on the hybrid still. So if you've got the old batch, keep it, because the next batch that comes out will be really interesting to see how they taste side by side. But I love it. I think it's a really good apple brandy. It's nice, it's bright, it's got sweetness to it. It's got that nice tannin. The French oak really lends that nice spice to it as well. What do you guys think?
So I just wanted to say, like, just to reiterate the point, the 3 bottles that we used for this tasting that we divided up into your tasting kits were literally the last 3 bottles that we had on site at the distillery at all. In fact, Chewy, you had to steal them from the cellar door, right? I
did, yeah. They were actually in the... So obviously, because we have a cellar door on site, what they do is they put an order and we normally fulfill it out of the distillery. They put in the order. We then realized that we were 2 bottles down. So we were like, oh, we need 2 more bottles. We didn't have any in our distribution warehouse, which meant that the only stock we had left was at the distillery. And then there was nothing left on the pallets at the distillery. So the only stock left was actually in the pile that had already been ordered from the cellar door. So I had to tell him that I was taking 2 of his bottles for tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for, sharing your apple brandy with us all. I think everyone will admit this is a wonderful way to end the evening on this dessert. So just to recap, you take a cider essentially and you distill it once and it turns into brandy. You mature it for 2 years and that's it?
Yeah, it was actually twice distilled for this one. So it went through that alembics twice. And then it's been matured now for 2018. What are we on now? 19, 20, 21. So it's 3 years old.
Awesome. I'm just going to share my screen because I jumped on your website very quickly to get a picture of your stills. Can everyone see that?
There he is. So that's Warwick. So
can you walk us through what we're seeing here, left to right?
Yeah, absolutely. So on your far left is our pot component. So the big stainless steel jacket around it, that's our heating jacket. So that's stainless, that's water. So essentially it's all steam powered. Then you've got the pot component, which sits within that, comes up. And then at the very top of that is your reflux bulb. So we've obviously got a very narrow reflux. So we're looking to produce quite a light style of spirit. As you can see as well, at the very top of there, we've got that thermometer. So that's where we kind of gauge all of those temperatures that I was talking about before. The spirit then, or the vapor, should I say, at that point, then goes up. You can see that metal tube coming out the top, across and then down. And you can see down the bottom of the column, there's then a little feed in. So that's where the vapor goes. We've got 5 plates within that still. So they basically overlap kind of like so. So the alcohol vapor has to get all the way through. Each time it touches one of those plates, it will recondense, come back down and redistill again until it gets to the very top. Once it gets to the very top, so the next little cylinder, that's our vapor basket. So when we're talking whiskey, that's shut off. We don't use it. We don't need it. When we're talking gin, that's where we put all of our botanicals. So when it's on, it will come again back down. You can see a pipe feeding down the bottom of it, and then it will come in again to the bottom, and then it will feed up through the top. It will then come out the side there. You can see a little tube going into the side, and then that big long column there, that's our condenser. So that is what we essentially run cold liquid through, or cold water through. There's a tube or a pipe that basically spirals through down to the little collector in the bottom, and that cools down the vapor back into a liquid, so that when it comes out of that little tap, which I don't know if you can really see, it's a tap on this picture, a little tap on the bottom, it comes out as a spirit. Those are our collecting vessels down the bottom. So on your left hand side, as you look at it, that's where we put our falls and faints, or heads and tails, or whatever you want to call them. And on the right, that's where we put all of our hearts. The reason why we do that, obviously, is because methanol actually evaporates at a lower temperature. So 68 degrees Celsius, methanol will start to evaporate at. So as you're heating your still up, the first stuff to come off will be methanol. Then at 78 degrees, you start getting pure ethanol. And then at 82 degrees Celsius, you start getting rubbing alcohols coming through. So, you've got your cuts there. Essentially, each distillery is a little bit different, depending on what you want to achieve and what flavor compounds you want to get in there. They're not all 100% bad. But what we collect as the falls and faints then go into the distillation run on the next run. All of that condenser water that comes out, we actually collect. And like I said before, we then use that on the mash tun for the following mash. Anyone got any questions on that?
Awesome setup. Thanks for walking us through that.
Window. I think that was just before we got the window as well. You can see where it's been cut out. So there's a little bit of natural light now just behind the still, so that the distillers don't go stir crazy in there. You see, it looks like it was cut in, but they've got like a fencing or something in front of it. So it's quite a nice view there now.
Hey, Chewy, what's the fill capacity of the pot? Because I think this picture makes it look bigger than it actually is.
Yeah, so the full capacity is 2,000 litres, but obviously we don't normally quite fill to that. We normally go in at about 1,000 or so. So yeah, 2,000 is pretty much to the brim.
Yeah, that photo that you guys are seeing there is kind of taken from an up angle. So I don't know. I mean, if you walk right up to it, it's sort of like the curve of the still sort of starts at about eye level. So it's not actually huge. Yeah. Yeah, poor AJ. So one of our distillers, AJ, used to be a jockey. So he's not the tallest man in the world. So we have to have a little step ladder getting into the still so that you can see inside it. But yeah, for most people, you can just kind of see straight in.
It's an awesome little setup. And where exactly are you guys located?
So Hay Valley, it's called. So spelled Hay Valley. It's between Woodside and Lobethal, which are the two nearest towns. But Adelaide Hills. So for anyone who's been to Adelaide Hills, if you go on the expressway and you go past Harndorf, keep on going. It's got its own little turn off now, and you can turn off to Nairn. But yeah, before I moved to South Australia, I'd never heard of these places either. So I don't expect anybody to know where I'm talking about. But it's a beautiful part of the world. It is really nice. Very green.
Next time when the borders finally open, come visit
Absolutely,
the distilleries.
Yeah.
I've just put up a little poll. I'm curious to see what everyone's favorite of tonight is. So submit your votes. We'll let it run for the next minute or next. Yeah. Any other questions? Let me just have a look at the chat here. Why do you only fill 1,000 liters if it's a 2,000 capacity from Aaron?
Generally, like 2,000, we find is, it doesn't. We don't really get the reflux that we want, but two, it's a little over full for what we're looking to achieve. So yeah, we've just kind of, and also as well, we're very much limited by our mash tun as well. So our mash tun is only 1,000 litre mash tun. So it means that we can't fill to 2,000 litres on whiskey runs anyway. So for the whiskey, we've got no choice. For the gin, we do, but we still choose to only fill to 1,000 litres.
Yeah, great. Looks like a soup pot. If you fill it too high, it'll boil over. Fred, that's your comment.
That's me. It's like anything. You don't always want to fill it to the very, very tippity top because, we're talking about heat and pressure and liquid and all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Another question from Gerald. Which of your products are your favorite? Fred, over to you first.
Look, I got to be honest. I'm a massive Brandy fan. I'm obviously like a whiskey professional first and foremost. I love drinking this stuff, but I am a huge fan of Brandy, and I would love to see us produce more of it. I think Brandy makes a lot of sense in the Australian context because we grow so much fruit here. I just wish that people were more into it so that we could make more of it and have a good chance of selling it. Of these whiskeys that we've got in front of us, I was super excited when I tasted the smoke for the first time. I just thought it was a really cool idea and an innovative way of doing it. But I think Musket Cask is probably top of the pile for me.
Awesome. Thank you. Chewy?
Oh, the diplomatic response. They're all like my children. I couldn't pick one over the other.
but if you had to pick one.
Oh, definitely whiskey. No, I come from a whiskey background. For those that know me, probably might remember me from my time at the Baxter Inn. So I come from a whiskey background, and I enjoy whiskey. And to be producing whiskey is awesome. So yeah, it's certainly probably my favorite child at the minute. And yeah, also the D's. For those who've tried it, I'm seeing the comments popping up. We've got the Fuchsia gin as well. When we sponsored them, obviously last year wasn't a great season, so didn't do particularly well. But this year, I'm with you. I think the D's have got it.
Awesome. Shall we see the results of the poll? Let me share it. Looks like we have a tie. Musket and smoked.
Ooh.
There you go.
All the way.
I think it's pretty indicative of just people's general tastes in whiskey, right? Like sometimes people are going to prefer that real sort of like more kind of fortified wine, sweeter style, and other people really, sort of gravitate towards those big, heavy kind of smoky Isla whiskeys. So that's obviously part of what we're trying to do is, produce whiskeys that a wide range of people are going to enjoy.
Well, Fred, what did you vote for?
Me?
Yeah.
I abstained from the voting.
Did you?
I'm gonna let the people decide.
I voted for smoked, so technically the Musket Cask won.
Oh, there you go.
My vote shouldn't really count.
That's top praise. Native grain. I actually thought that was quite impressive. Very silky and great mouthfeel. But love the musket. The smoke is so different.
I think the thing is with the native grain too, obviously being under the 78 banner and being a much higher price point than the Australian whiskey, a lot of people think that it's the premium Australian whiskey, but it's not. If you like the Australian whiskey, you're not necessarily going to like the native grain because the taste profile is completely different. And I think that's kind of the beauty of it. It is something that appeals to a different audience, more of that rye drinker.
That was another really important question from Corey. How long did it take to grow that epic beard, Fred?
Me, I was clean shaven this morning, mate.
It's looking good. All right, just looking. Any last questions? Otherwise, we might call it a night. Love a peated whiskey from Daniel, but went the native grain. Super different. Great example how you guys are doing things differently. Couldn't agree more. Ben says excited about the unique native components, makes itself known in the flavor profile. You guys. There's going to be in the global awards, there'll be like next couple of years, there'll be a native grain whiskey category for sure. Like everyone's going to be jumping on board. There's so much native flora in Australia. We know it in the gin categories, obviously, but it's interesting to see that now trickle over into the whiskey.
Yeah, we honestly do hope so. Like, we hope that people start focusing more on what's local, and we also hope, obviously, that growers start to get on board and start producing it as well, so we can get it a bit more readily available.
And Gerald just asked for the Corsair. Do you roughly know what the ratio for wine and ex-bourbon casks are?
It's just the 2 casks, isn't it, Chew? Just 1 bourbon and 1 wine, and that's it.
Exactly. We've got 200 litres of each. So we're just marrying 50-50 at the minute. But it's not been bottled or released. So it's what you guys tried today was equal parts. But yeah, it might not be that when it's finally put together. But as we've got a cask of each, probably would just make sense. I think we really enjoy it as equal parts. So that would probably kind of dictate it as well.
It's coming out smoked liqueur next year sometime. Surprise, but go to 78 Degrees. That's the website. .com.au.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sign up to their mailing list. We've got a special off just for the Musket Cask tonight. Some of the whiskies we tried have sold out or if not yet to be made. So sign up for that if you want to get a great deal for the Musket Cask tonight. Otherwise, jump on our website, thewhiskylist.com.au, search 78 Degrees, and you'll see we've got about 75 different independent whiskey stores and a couple of the big chains. So we'll tell you the nearest place you can buy it, and hopefully Ozpost will get it to you. Or if you live nearby, visit the cellar door. Shop local, support locals, support indie. That's our sort of ethos here as well. So, thank you for any other sort of last questions.
Please, if you're ever up anywhere near the distillery as well, I'm there generally most days of the week. Please let yourself be known, and I'd love to take any of you through to show you where we make all of our whiskey and other spirits.
As soon as we can get out of Sydney, I haven't been to Adelaide in such a long time. There's so much to see and do there, but you guys are top of my list now after tonight.
Absolutely. I say, give me a buzz, reach out.
All right. David, Fred, Red Gum Cast. Yes. Are you guys any plans using Aussie wood to mature your whiskey?
Yeah, no, I just said it's definitely something that we're considering and that we're thinking about, and finding out different ways to use, as well as native grains and, local wine casks, to figure out, other ways of incorporating Australian native timbers into the production process as well. Obviously, we're still relatively new to the whiskey game, but those type of innovations are really key to us. And again, as we said, not kind of following the pack and trying to figure out ways to really help define what Australian whiskey means. So yeah, definitely something that we're looking into.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that's it in terms of questions. Last 10 more seconds. Otherwise, I might call it a night again. Fred and no questions coming in. No. All right. Chewy and Fred, thank you so much for your time tonight. I know we kind of planned to sit around an hour and a bit. We're hour and a half, a little bit over. So thank you everyone for staying online and, enjoying this. This has been such a fun session, super informative, educational, but yeah, the diversity of flavors here. And you guys are doing something completely different, which is what we love to see on the Australian scene. So thank you, gents. And we've recorded the session. If you didn't get your kits, come along to next Thursday. These guys are going to do it all over again for us. So, but thank you so much, gents. Any last final words to cap it off?
Yeah, I'd just like to say very much thank you for having us, and to everyone who was here tonight as well. Thanks for spending your night with us. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks for doing it. Appreciate it. We had a great night.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys all so much for being here. It's something that we've wanted to do for ages. So it's really nice to have the chance to talk to everyone and show you these whiskies.
No worries. Well, I might call it finish there. Fred and Chewy, I might ask you just stay on for a couple of minutes afterwards. But otherwise, everyone else will bid you farewell tonight. If you can just jump off the call. Thanks. We'll see you at the next one.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
There we go. Awesome, gents. I'll just hit stop on the record. Where the hell's record gone? Pause recording. Stop. There we go.